Hello. I want to begin by extending a warm welcome to all of you who are joining us for the second event in the three-part webinar series on faith-based approaches to environmental peacebuilding. As we gather from around the world, I want to first acknowledge that we are gathering, even if virtually, on the traditional homelands of Native peoples, including the Haudenosaunee, Miami, Peoria, and particularly the Pokagon Potawatomi, who have been using this land for education for thousands of years and continue to do so. These events are a part of the Road to Geneva series, which is an initiative of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, and they are co-sponsored by the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame, as well as the advocacy group Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. On behalf of all of us, we are thankful that you have joined us here today. Major themes in this series on faith-based environmental peacebuilding include interfaith dialogue, decolonization, and futurism. After a discussion of interfaith dialogue last week, today we will be discussing Decolonizing the Land, Christian grassroots approaches to environmental peacebuilding. We look forward to hearing from a distinguished panel of community leaders and environmental advocates from around the world. To open today's event, I will share a poem by Joy Harjo, a member of the Muscogee Nation and recent U.S. National Poet Laureate. She will also be speaking at Notre Dame on Monday if anyone is interested in joining that event. This poem is titled, This Morning I Pray for My Enemies. And whom do I call my enemy? An enemy must be worthy of engagement. I turn in the direction of the sun and keep walking. It's the heart that asks the question, not my furious mind. The heart is the smaller cousin of the sun. It sees and knows everything. It hears the gnashing even as it hears the blessing. The door to the mind should only be open from the heart. An enemy who gets in risks the danger of becoming a friend. This morning or evening, depending on where you are, we are joined by Father Emmanuel Katongore, founder of Bethany Land Institute in Uganda and professor of theology and peace studies at the University of Notre Dame. We are also joined by Daoud Nasser, director of operations at Tent of Nations Farm in Palestine. And finally, we are joined by Katie Shoestick, Farm to School Coordinator at Red Cloud Indian School on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. Welcome to each of you, and thank you for joining us. So without further delay, let's get the conversation started. Would each of you mind to take a minute or two to introduce yourself, your organization, and the kind of work that you do around the environment? Let's start with Father Emmanuel, if you will.
Well, thank you, Alyssa, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And thank you all for being here. My name is Father Emmanuel Katongore. I'm a priest of Kampala Archdiocese in Uganda. So Uganda is my native home. I'm a professor of theology and international peace studies at Notre Dame, part of the Kroc Institute and the Keough School of Global Affairs. Currently, I am in Uganda, actually, where I'm working on Bethany Land Institute. Bethany Land Institute was founded in 2015, in response to three major challenges that are affecting the rural communities in much of Uganda, really in much of Africa. The challenge of food insecurity, the challenge of ecological degradation, and the challenge of poverty and unemployment, especially for young people. So these are the three challenges that the founders, three of us, saw in 2015 and decided to found Bethany Land Institute to respond to those challenges. In these, we are also very much inspired by the letter by Pope Francis Laudato Si that calls for an integrated approach, that in order to hear the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth, whatever approaches that one comes up must be integrated to fight poverty, take care of creation, but also restore human dignity, especially to the poor. So at Bethany Land Institute, we work with the young people and train them in sustainable integrated agriculture, in ecological care, but also in modes of economic empowerment. They spend with us 2.5 years in the training formation program, and then they go back and set up their farms in the rural communities where they become an inspiration and leaders and teach others. In this way, we hope through these young people that we train, there will be a new ecological renewal in the rural communities, but also a flourishing, revitalization really of the rural communities throughout Uganda. So that's what we do at Bethany Land Institute.
Thank you, Father Emmanuel. Can we turn to Daoud next?
Yes, first of all, thank you so much. I'm glad to be with you today and to talk about a bit about the Tent of Nations. My name is Dawood Nassar, and Dawood is the Arabic name for David. The Tent of Nations is connected with a farm that belongs to my family, that my family bought 100 years ago. And the land is located southwest of Bethlehem on a nice hilltop that is surrounded today by 5 Israeli Jewish settlements, and which makes it the only hilltop in our area that is without a settlement. The land was bought, and we have all documents that prove our ownership to the land. In 1991, the Israeli authorities declared the farm as state land, and the idea is to confiscate it and build more settlements. So we responded legally, and it was a long way, of course, and it is still a long way. In 2001, we were facing many difficulties, and we said, what can we do in this situation? Attacks from settlers, military, and we said, should we respond in a violent way, or should we sit down and cry and become a victim, or should we run away and leave? So we said none of those options is good for us. We started to believe there must be another way of resistance and without violence. And when we said without violence, we had to fix ourselves and believe that this is the right way to do it in order to empower other people. And that's why we said 4 things that became our principles. We said we refuse to be victims. It was important to move ourselves out of the victim mentality. We said we refuse to hate. We are acting differently based on our faith, Christian faith, and we believe in justice. With those 4 principles, we created a nonviolent way of resistance under the slogan, we refuse to be enemies, and we started the Tent of Nations. And with the Tent of Nations, of course, we have many restrictions there. So we started to solve our problems in a creative way. So we have no access to running water. We started collecting rainwater. We have no access to electricity. We have solar system. We have compost oil. You know, all of that would help us to stand up and act in a different way. And today we have about 15,000 visitors every year, not this year and last year, of course. We host many volunteers, and we do children's summer camp activities. And the idea is to make the farm a place where people can come and see and go back home motivated to tell the story.
Wow, thank you for sharing that, Daoud. And finally, let's hear from Katie.
Thank you, Elsa. I'm really grateful to be here today with Father Emmanuel and Daoud, both to hear about your organizations and to together, advance in environmental peace building. Red Cloud Indian School is really an exciting place to work for at the moment, as we are re-envisioning and recreating how our institution is, supporting young people in the future. So currently, we have some new initiatives at Red Cloud taking shape, including a Lakota language immersion program where our students and younger grades are gradually having the opportunity to learn in their traditional Lakota language as part of a language revitalization. Another really important initiative is a Truth and Healing initiative to care for those survivors of boarding school history. And then to think about how Red Cloud can move forward in changing to address that history and, change its structure and systems and move forward in a decolonized way. And then I'm here today to, in particular, through the context of environmental peace building, share about our Farm to School initiative, which utilizes regenerative growing practices, which we know have really been taught and shared from Indigenous groups to produce foods for both learning and education in our schools, and also to support local food system development in the community. In Pine Ridge, we collaborate with the Lakota Food Sovereignty Coalition, which is part of a broader network of local activists and change makers and growers seeking to, support local foods development, because we know that in the history of United States colonization, right, an intentional mechanism for control was to disrupt traditional Lakota foodways. And so the Lakota Food Sovereignty Coalition is really working to support local food systems development as resistance, as caring for the environment, as caring for people in the community, and as a way of preserving and using and carrying on traditional Lakota plant knowledge. And so I'm really grateful that at Red Cloud we're able to participate in that and involve our students in that work, who ultimately, as young activists, are some of the greatest change makers that we have.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah. So I think this is a fascinating conversation. And one thing that makes it so interesting is that the three of you come from such different contexts around the world, but are grappling with perhaps interconnected issues. So we have Palestine, Uganda, and the United States. Yet in this panel, you're brought together under this common discussion of decolonization. And I know, Daoud, you mentioned the occupation. Katie, you mentioned the history of colonization in the US and boarding schools. And Father Emmanuel, in Uganda, you're in a nation that has certainly been touched by a colonial past as well. And so to help us understand how this experience, or this term decolonization, is perhaps coherent and has connections across these contexts, or maybe is incoherent and is a different experience around the world. I would love if you would each highlight for us how that term relates to your context, how you think about colonization, and then how you work to combat it. So perhaps we'll switch up the order this time, and if you're willing to jump in, Daoud, would you be willing to take the first answer to this question?
Well, yes, as I said before, maybe the location of the farm is on the occupied West Bank, and this is an occupied territory from 1967. And our biggest problem there is land confiscation and building settlements and expanding the existing ones. And this is affecting life for the Palestinians, and also affecting, of course, like their daily life. They cannot move from one place to another. They cannot farm their land. They have no access to resources, like especially like water. And we as a family, as many other Palestinian families, are affected by that. As I mentioned before, in 1991, the Israeli authorities declared the farm as state land, and we started a legal battle that is going on until today. Throughout the years, we have a lot of attacks from the Israeli settlers. They came and cut our trees, they damaged our water tanks, they threatened us with guns, and they tried many times to build roads on our land, but we managed to stop that by court. And we got so far about 25 demolition orders. Like on our own land, we cannot build anything. And many also stories like destruction of our fruit trees. The biggest one, 2014, about hundreds of fruit trees were destroyed by the army about 10 days before the apricot harvest. So this is the daily life that we are facing here. And this is not, as I mentioned before, the only the family story. No, this is the story of many other people who are affected by that, which means on the ground that makes it difficult to live a normal life and try to develop your own land.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from you, Dawood, is that the processes and the experience of colonization and its like physical manifestation is very much happening today, and it continues to impact your farm specifically and also the community around you more broadly. So thank you for sharing that. Now let's turn to Katie, if you're able to share.
Yeah. So I wanted to offer that I think decolonization happens in a couple of ways. People can work on individual levels, but I would be remiss to fail to acknowledge that like settler violence and colonization is still happening today. We still are living in violation of treaties that were written. This past summer, in the midst of the pandemic, we had the President of the United States come to the Black Hills, which is Treaty Lakota land, after being asked not to come for the safety of the community. And we saw the National Guard present armed resistance, right, to Indigenous activists demonstrating that that was unacceptable. And so we need to, honor the treaties. We don't just see that here with the Lakota Nation, right? We see that with First Nations across the US. Currently, we can see that happening in the fight over Line 3 in Minnesota, where they're threatening the treaty rights of the Ojibwe. And so it's really important that we address those current acts of colonization still happening within the United States, and recognize that. But additionally, right, we see that happening through efforts at the school, for instance, such as the Lakota immersion program, right, where the culture is being revitalized and introduced in the school. Recently, South Dakota added Lakota language as an official language that was recognized within the schools. So clearly, we're making steps of progress, but there's a long way to go. but ways that I see that happening specifically at Red Cloud include things like the language revitalization, inclusion of Indigenous knowledge of plants, inclusion of like spiritual practices and teachings. But we have to recognize also that as a country, we're currently enacting settler violence.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out so strongly, especially since I think it is so common in the United States to kind of assume the wrongs of colonization and the wrongs of genocide against Native Americans are something of the past, and that's often how it's taught and thought about. But as you pointed out, it really is clear that colonialism is a very pervasive process and something that still exists today. So thank you. And finally, we'll turn to Father Emmanuel in Uganda.
Where I am in Uganda, but also a great part of Africa, we can make a distinction between colonialism as a historical event. Whereas most of that has ended, and in many places, except in places like South Africa, it didn't last for a long time, maybe a period of 45, 30 years. The far more insidious forms of colonialism still live on. As a historical fact, colonialism usually in Africa, took two ways. There was settler colonialism, where the colonialists came and settled in places like South Africa and in Kenya. But those were actually the fewer cases. In many cases, colonialism took an indirect colonialism, working through the chiefs and the other local leaders. And that, by and large, has ended. But the far more insidious form of colonialism in terms of colonial mindset has kept on, especially in relation to land. Two things happened in relation to land. When the colonialists came, first of all, they tried to demystify or demythologize land. From a traditional native point of view, land is not just a commodity. Land is a living organism, a sense of deep connection, actually. What connects the living to other living beings and other living peoples to the living dead is a source of identity. So there is a deep, within a native spirituality, there is a deep connection with the land. So one of the first things the colonialists did was to try to deny that, and therefore turn land into a commodity, into a thing that could be easily exploited and easily transferable from one to the other through land title. The second thing then that happened was at the same time to paganize or make primitive any association with the land. In other words, land was turned into something negative. Any association with the land was characterized as primitive, as backward, as paganism. That is what had to be overcome in order to come into the sunny light of modernity and civilization. So through bombardment of the education system and other forms of teaching, the relationship to the land in a way became altered. Anybody who went to school began to feel a kind of uneasy tension with the land. Now begin to see it as primitive, as backward. That's not what you work with, especially when you go to school. You have to look at it in a negative way. And it is only for the backward people, for the primitive people. So that kind of the colonial mindset that actually still lives on in terms of the mindset. So colonialism, when we talk about colonialism, really, what we're talking about is the mindset that continues to think that where there is really nothing good about these local initiatives, about land, about any local initiatives, about any local aspects of life. the only good things have to come from the West, have to come from outside. And so there is a kind of almost a sort of kind of really looking negatively to anything local, nothing good out of the land, out of Africa. But at the same time, that mindset is in a way a sort of kind of extraversion that is always expecting solutions and expecting, in a way, redemption, if you like, civilization from outside. And so really despising everything that is local, including land. That also turns into a kind of slavish, really mimicry, imitating of everything foreign. So that is why now, when you see in connection with the land, the educated, they have this kind of really ambivalent relationship. I don't want to do anything with the land. At the same time, given the historical traditional background, they feel still a sense of affinity. Now, that's what has turned really into this kind of exploitative relationship with the land. So when you talk about decolonizing the land, it has to do really with changing a mindset, beginning to revalue and take care of creation of the land in positive ways, but also to try to, in a way, reconnect with some of the native and traditional ways of valuing and taking care of the land.
Yeah, thank you for adding to that perspective about, even in a context where the colonizing forces have withdrawn, there's still this process of colonialism that continues on, and this idea that everything must be Western in order to be valuable. And I know that your work with Bethany Land Institute is very much working to present alternative narratives to that one. So thank you for sharing. And now that we've sort of dug into the challenges of colonialism and those that are very pervasive and the structural violence and the physical violence that continues, I want to turn to a vision of the future. So there's a really beautiful piece that I admire called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang. And these two discuss the importance of imagining futures that are incommensurable with the current structures of society as a way forward towards decolonization that is, actual and makes substantive change and isn't just providing lip service to the idea. So I'm curious, from your three perspectives and the perspectives of the communities in which you work, what are the futures that you imagine for the earth, for the communities you are a part of, and the relationship between them, between the earth or the land and the communities? Katie?
Yeah, I think that question, at least in my context, within the community that I get to live and work in, Father Emmanuel's point leads in really beautifully in that there's not much envisioning that has to happen to think about what it looks like to live in relationship with the earth, right? Because that is so inherently present in Lakota teaching and spirituality and traditions, right? The earth provided, right? And continues to provide, although in the colonized space that, is currently inhabited, there's a little bit more of disconnect at moments that movements like the Lakota food sovereignty movements are seeking to address, right? But that relationship has always been there, right? Like the earth provides plants that are medicines that heal, that can be prayed with. One of the elders that I'm closest with and have learned so much from, Basil Braveheart, offers that he prays with water every morning, right? Water is life. There's an understanding that the earth, right, is a being, and each thing on the earth, right, is also a being, right? In sweat ceremonies, like the rocks are the stones that hold the heat, that releases the steam, right, are like grandfathers. And so recognizing that there's, that knowledge of that relationship is already present in the community. So it's a question of how can resources be allocated in a just way to support the work of Indigenous change makers and activists seeking to make that future a reality and decolonize spaces and structures and systems to be able to honor that. And recognizing that that's not just something that needs to happen within tribal nations, right? But as we see that the need for broader reform in how we do things as not just a country, but as a world with bigger issues like climate change, right? We all need to learn from those Indigenous voices.
Yeah, thank you. And Father Emmanuel, since Katie sort of engaged with what you had just said, would you like to take the next go at this question?
Well, I see at least two practices that are coming out of this mindset, colonial mindset that I talked about, that are kind of characterize life in present day Uganda, but in many African countries as well. The first practice is because of this bombardment and the mindset is the thinking reinforced by also economic theory, IMF, that the road to civilization, the road to development, the ladder of development has to move from the village to the city, that the city is where development happens. And so because of all that bombardment and mindset, we see an flow of people, a great migration of people from the rural communities into the city looking for development, civilization, whatever it is. Of course, they never really end up in the cities. They get stuck in the slums. So you see a growing number of slums in Africa, but around the world. So that is one trend that we are trying to really counter by providing an alternative story, by saying, development, flourishing can and does take place in the rural communities, in the village. So our institute, Bethany Land Institute, is set up in the village and working with some of the young people, some of them who have migrated to the city, to the slums, and trying to really attract them back to the villages where they can have a comfortable and a decent lifestyle, at the same time contributing to the renewal of creation. So our effort really is directed towards changing that mindset and showing that actually a rural living can be sustainable, it can be economically empowering, and can take care of creation and restore dignity at the same time. The other practice connected with that is become really almost synonymous with the farming these days in terms of the conventional farming, is that in order to farm these days, you have to use all these chemical fertilizers and so forth that keep really bombarding the land with all these chemical fertilizers. And therefore that is contributing to the ecological problems and the land becoming more and more arid and therefore requiring more and more artificial or chemical stimulation. We are also trying to go against that and showing that really, if you take care of creation, if you take care of land in natural ways, farming, as some people call it, in God's way, in terms of nurturing the ecosystem and respecting and listening to the ecosystem and trying to really enhance the inner dynamism of the ecosystem in a natural way, you can actually produce food and other crops, not only for human consumption, but also for the market in sustainable ways. So that's what we are doing in terms of sustainable farming, in terms of integrated farming, in terms of organic farming, really trying to take care of the earth from that natural point of view, which is really going against the grain, because most of the farming now is kind of conventional farming that is using all these chemical pesticides and fertilizers. So we try to do it the natural way. I guess these are some of the ways that you might say that are incommensurable with the great trend of modernity and the colonial mindset in Uganda and in Africa as a whole.
Yeah, thank you. And then last but not least, we will turn to Daoud to share what your vision and your community's vision might look like for the future.
Well, like the nowadays situation, of course, we always say the resources are not distributed equally, and there are always like conflicts in the world around that, where the strongest wants to control the weak. In our case, it's more about the political the political situation that must be changed in order for people to live a normal life. Like in our situation, we are living under occupation, and occupation is controlling the life of people in all aspects, and people cannot live a normal life. So when occupation comes to an end, and when also colonialism is ended there, where people can get back to their land and get their rights back, and then start from there, a new beginning, to reconcile with the land, to go back to the land. Because I always say we all belong to the ground, we all belong to the land. And when people in a situation like that can get together, can start a new beginning, of thinking together, not only for their sake, but for the sake of the new generation. We need to save ourselves, to save the people, but also to save the land from this danger. And it's very important to start also educating children at schools, because environmental education in our area, for example, is not a big theme at schools. So children are growing up without having any connection to the land. And that's why it's very important to change ourselves and transform ourselves and start a new beginning and be connected with the land again.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. So we are looking to transition soon to taking questions from the audience. So if you are in the audience, feel free to enter questions in the Q&A box, and we will receive those on our end and try to integrate them into the conversation, as many as we possibly can. But before we transition, I have just one more question to sort of bring the final theme of today's conversation to the light, which is about how faith plays into this conversation and into the work that each of you do. So throughout history and today, colonialism has been problematically intertwined with the church, which has both participated in and authorized the displacement and the enslavement, the disenfranchisement of various communities identified as the other. And these colonial attitudes have also been directed towards the land, which many of you have pointed out, that we have ownership of the land, we have the ability to exploit it. However, there are also meaningful traditions of liberation within Christianity that have provided inspiration for movements of abolition, of decolonization, of liberation, and environmentalism. And so in light of this sort of dual history, and in light of the way that faith informs your work, how do you and your organization interact with faith, and how does it relate to the mission and the efforts that you have towards decolonization? So perhaps we will turn back to Father Emmanuel.
Well, in terms of talking about the faith aspect of that, one comment I can make is that colonialism has affected all of us. We have all been stained by colonialism. Everything, including the church, including whatever organization, whatever institution, nobody can say, oh, we stand outside that movement. And so forth. Everything has been stained in a way. It's similar to, for example, racism. However, for me, the challenge is how do we find liberative moments within some of the tradition that we hold dear, like Christianity? Can we find some liberative moments, images, stories that can provide a starting point for a new future? That is why, for us, the image of Bethany has been very, very crucial. My interest and research around this name, Bethany, and Dawood might correct me if I'm wrong, after I spent 2.5 weeks really researching around this name, that means traditionally house of the poor. That is just on the other side of Jerusalem. That is a village during Jesus's time. And the most significant thing is that during Jesus's time, he never stayed in Jerusalem. He always stayed at Bethany, and the house of the poor. I mean, that's very, very significant in terms of kind of providing a new sense of living among the poor, a friendship with the poor, at home with the poor. And I began to see the image of Bethany as the image of Africa, a marginalized continent, or the rural communities in Africa and so forth. But that is where, in a way, a new dynamism, spiritual dynamism, theological dynamism can take place. And so at Bethany Land Institute, we are using these stories that we read that are connected with Bethany, whether it's the story of Martha, of Mary, of Lazarus, of the fig tree, and all those stories in a way that we read in scripture, in the New Testament, to kind of provide the kind of the ethos of what might happen when God dwells among the poor, the kind of energy that can be released, the kind of potential, the kind of creativity and innovativeness. And so we are using that in a way, image and stories as the bedrock, if you like, to re-energize also our innovativeness and our thinking about the possibilities that faith can inject into the movement for liberation. Granted that, as you say, as a church as a whole, Christianity as a whole is also stained with the colonialism. But within that, one can find those liberative moments. And so for us, the image and the figure of Bethany is very, very crucial as a kind of touchstone for the kind of liberative movement that we want to do, or decolonizing movement that we are engaged in terms of the activities of creation care, but also economic empowerment with the poor.
Wow, yes, that really paints a powerful image of Bethany and the reason why you've named your organization Bethany Land Institute. That's really meaningful. Dawood, would you add next?
Well, of course, like at our work at the Tent of Nations, faith is the center of the work that we are doing, because without faith, we cannot move forward. And faith, of course, like the belief in the invisible. It's not like something that you can get in your hand and feel it. No, you have to believe in it. And faith, I believe, like faith is like acting now. And in a situation like ours, we need the people to act now, not to wait for tomorrow. And like a farmer, when he wants to, like when he plants the seeds, he doesn't think about the, how those seeds will grow and the outcome of that and the fruits and all of that. No, he is doing his work. He's doing his work right now. And that's why depending on faith is very important, because we need, as people, as Christians, also to do our part, and God will continue. God will do his side of the work. In our work at the Tent of Nations, nobody believed that that this can be a successful story. Like with all the challenges that we've been facing on the farm, nobody believed that we can exist until today. But this is because of faith, like believing that this is the right way to do it. And with faith, we can encourage other people. And as in the scripture says, you know, faith can move mountains. Here, I want to distinguish also between faith and religion, because in our area, also religions are being abused or misused for political purposes. So, so faith is different than religions. Faith needs to read the scriptures and understand it. We are reminded with this story when Philip was going down to Gaza, like a guy was reading the scriptures in Acts, and then Philip appeared to him and he said, "Do you understand what you are reading?" And this is very important. It's not about the practices of our religion. It's about do we understand what we are reading? And that's why it is important to focus on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And finally, Katie.
Yeah, I guess to start, Red Cloud being a Jesuit school within the Lakota community, right, makes the interfaith dialogue happening very naturally between Jesuits, Jesuit Ignatian spirituality within the Roman Catholic Church, and Lakota spirituality. And I think that there are moments of beautiful intersectionality, but particularly in such teachings in the church, like Care of Creation, which Pope Francis wrote an encyclical in recent years that highlighted the need to, care for the environment and address issues like commodification of the land, which not only leads to negative environmental outcomes, but is also connected with commodification of people and impacts that carry negative outcomes for various communities in disproportionate ways. But we can't, and then with the Jesuit tradition specifically, we can connect that with cura personalis, the care for the whole person, right? So in our work, we can identify ways that we're caring for the whole person and that we cannot do that without also caring for the environment. But we can't neglect that so much of what has happened and continues to happen in politics, in Western agriculture, in many things, right? It finds its roots in Christian perspectives of manifest destiny in biblical writings, right? In Genesis, I think, it says something to the effect of like, have dominion and multiply, right? So the Catholic Church specifically has a large work to do and undertaking to address those things and really move forward. I think the church leader offering a writing is an important step, but I don't think that means that the church is necessarily engaging in change making. So I think that work like the Truth and Healing Initiative at Red Cloud, where Macabre Black Elk is intentionally working to address the specific manifestation of that in boarding school history enacted by Jesuit institutions, right, is so impactful. And I do hope that that becomes the norm moving forward for that religious institution. That said, the Lakota dialogue that happens, right, Indigenous spirituality isn't offered in the same way, right? There aren't encyclicals published. There's not a loud, booming institution to ensure that that voice is heard. So here, where those voices are so present, it's easier to do that dialogue, right? But I think it's important that in a broader context, Indigenous voices are lifted so that that dialogue can be happening, because otherwise other voices lifted through institutions with hierarchy and you know, just all of the history going along that creates power structures with louder voices, right, kind of prevents a healthy dialogue. But even just in the work of growing, I think we see like a spiritual dialogue happening, right? When we, for instance, like discuss harvesting Timsala, right? Because it's not just harvesting, you replant the seeds at the top of the plant into the soil so that it comes back year to year, which is a traditional teaching where it's just so a part that you add back and never take. And so I think that those dialogues happen in little moments as well, and not even just in large publications. So also listening to like those little moments where teachings do take place and dialogues do take place.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks for bringing in that concept of dialogue as well. You know, kind of interacting with the first session on interfaith dialogue and a lot of questions we have coming in that are also relating to how to foster dialogue between different communities around these issues. So we have a lot of really, really incredible questions from the audience, and I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, but I'll try to cover as much ground as possible. And if you and the audience will give us a little bit of leeway, we can perhaps run till 12:05 or 12:10 Eastern time. I know there are many different time zones involved in this call, so about 15 to 20 more minutes. So I'm going to ask these questions and direct them towards an individual respondent, and then if others want to join in with responses as well, feel free, but just to cover as many questions as possible, I think I'll direct them towards one specific person, and then we can move to a next question addressing another. So first, I'm going to start with a question for Daoud, because I know you are in a region, you mentioned the difference between faith and religion, the presence of religious conflict and religious diversity in the region where you are. So there's a question from the audience that says, it seems that a primary strategy for Christian efforts towards justice, reconciliation, and shalom is to develop deep interpersonal relationships that cut across the boundaries of conflict. How does your work facilitate those relationships, and what challenges do you face in making those relationships meaningful?
Well, you know, let us say the political situation is forcing people or is not giving the people the opportunity to live a normal life and get an interaction with one another. So, you know, like there is an oppressor and there is an oppressed, and the relationship is not on eye level. So it's very hard for people to come together and start thinking about a better future as long as the political situation on the ground is not changing. Still, that doesn't mean that things are not possible. Well, for example, at the Tent of Nations, we host people from different backgrounds, religions, and countries. And the idea is for us is to build a bridge of understanding, of reconciliation and peace. But we are not doing a dialogue with people. We are trying to introduce our situation to those people. For example, when we had our trees being cut, being destroyed by the army, we had American Jewish group who came and sponsored and planted trees. You know, so they came as a sign of solidarity. So it's a way. You know, it's important to focus on building a bridge of understanding and keep going with that, trying to introduce our situation for the other, to the other. And of course, like in our one, you know, like our motto is we refuse to be an enemy, which is a non-violent way of resistance. It's like in a situation where we are surrounded by conflict, it's very important to say, I am not an enemy. My role is to build a bridge of understanding, you know. So it is a hard situation in this context, but as Christians, we need to keep going and think positively and try to change the reality. It's not easy, but this is our job and our mission.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that as well, how, you know, not all relationships are equal when there's an imbalance of power and a structure of oppression, but even so, there are ways to try and, you know, build understanding between groups and reconcile, however, not ignoring the reality that there are larger structures that do need to be addressed. So now I'm going to turn to Katie with another question. A lot of people are coming in with questions along the lines of, you know, what is it that we can do? What is it we can do to educate, to take action? And someone specifically addressed you, Katie, by saying, as Katie notes, there is a need to write the present day story of relationship between communities with varied cultures and history. Are there ways that have successfully encouraged this transformation? Any examples that can open doorways to deeper understanding and care? So again, along the lines of, are there examples of successful motion forward? How can we then take those examples, translate them into more action, more education, more learning in our own individual contexts and also national contexts, global contexts, etc.?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's such a simple answer that I'm going to offer, but I think so much of it is listening and making sure that stories are heard, right? And not just that they're heard, but like actively listened to and acted upon, right? Whether that's taking stances for advocacy, whether that's changing the way that we live our own lives by really internalizing that information or perspective. But there have just been so many moments where moments have been so charged recently, right? This in the last year or so. And so many times it's felt like really important things have fallen on deaf ears within the United States, right? With the political demonstration that I mentioned earlier in the Black Hills when the president came to visit, right? And Indigenous activist Nick Tilson was arrested and is still facing charges that have not been dropped. And the United Nations spoke about that and, you know, highlighted that as an injustice. And it is shocking to me that this isn't spoken more about broadly across the US. Issues about food access and health disparities have been, you know, especially highlighted during COVID regarding tribal nations specifically in the US. And, you know, I still feel that like that in so many ways isn't really being heard to the fullest extent. You know, the issues about language revitalization and indigenous plant knowledge have been at the forefront of media reporting recently as well as part of that. And, you know, I'm not sure that it's being heard, or at least it's hard to see that it's being heard. And so really making sure that, you know, that information, it reaches the ears of, you know, everyone in the US, and that change is made is really, really important. So just active listening and the like value of that can't be stated enough to my perspective.
Yeah, thank you. That's certainly something we don't do enough of, I think, in this country and in a context where it's so easy to only listen to the perspectives you're used to. So to wrap us up, I'm going to turn to Father Emmanuel. There are two questions that have been directed towards you. One person asking about, you know, how your vision expands for people of the African diaspora that want to embrace and amplify African land ethics. How can they get involved, or how can others get involved as well? And then a second respondent says, I was touched by Father Emmanuel's poetic comment, the land is not a commodity, but a living, storied organism. Can you speak to how this perspective walks the line between a cultural value of respect and stewardship and a faith-based moral obligation? So feel free to answer one or both of those, or perhaps something that combines the two.
Yeah, let me just say something first of all briefly about land as a living organism. I think this is something that I am learning myself over and over again. Being a product of the colonial education, I grew up saying that the further away I get from the village, the more educated, the better off I am. And now here I find myself as a professor of theology and international peace studies, going back and really discovering a love that I've missed all along. The love not only with creation, with nature, working with my own hands, planting and nurturing seeds, but also working with the people together in a community. Something that my education in a way kind of took me away in terms of a kind of an individualized pursuit of excellence. So this kind of deep connection is providing me with a sense of a reappreciation actually about who I am, my own identity, but also that kind of deep connection. But at the same time, I feel that is a kind of an invitation into the simplicity. There is something about the simplicity of working on the land with the hands and so forth that really invites us into that kind of humility, humanness that really grows out of the earth itself. And then kind of rediscovering really all these different connections. So I don't know whether I'm answering that connection, but I think it's a kind of an invitation really for me, for any one of us, to begin somehow, begin small, begin anywhere, reconnecting with that. And the gift of discovering new dimensions, not only about the land itself, but about oneself and about community are so immense. In connection to the other question about how does one begin and so forth, and maybe what does that mean in a different context other than my own context, Uganda, Africa, I really don't know. But I think it begins if you feel a kind of tugging at your heart with a come and see. Like I'm very, very much coming from this conversation, and I'm just noting down, I have to visit Dawood someday. I want to see Tent of Nations. I want to visit Kerry. And I would try to create time to kind of see what is going on there and kind of learn. So this kind of moments of come and see. And I'm sure you also, why you called together this panel might be connected to the fact that you have been to each of these initiatives and you have discovered something. So these kind of journeys to come and see, even if it's for a week, I think are the ones that kind of sow seeds within our own imagination and also reveal possibilities of what one might be able to do in their backyard, in their context. All is to say, I think there is no a formula, but also I feel as part of this, and maybe this is the faith journey, there is a sense, an invitation of attentiveness and listening to the kind of seeds, inspirations, and ideas that God sows in our minds as you listen to a speaker and so forth, and you kind of feel moved and so forth to act on whatever inspiration. I really like when Dawood said that faith is acting now. It's like a farmer, plant a seed and it will grow. How it will turn out, you never know. Yeah, and it will always be a surprise, I suppose. I guess this is one way of rambling through the questions, but I hope they provide a sense of invitation to do something, to go and see, to begin somewhere. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love that image of planting a seed with, the faith that something will grow from it, something productive and life-giving. So hopefully this event and the conversation we'll have next week will be some of those seeds that might begin to grow. So in conclusion, I wish we had more time to continue the conversation, but thank you all for joining us to discuss Decolonizing the Land, Christian Grassroots Approaches to Environmental Peacebuilding. A major thanks to each one of our panelists, Dawood Nassar, Father Emmanuel Katongore, and Katie Schustek. We hope that you will join us for the final event in the series next Thursday, February 25th at the same time. We will be discussing Practicing What We Preach, Dialogue and Futurism in Environmental Peacebuilding, with a reflection on futurism provided by PhD student Amaris Parks, and then an interactive discussion led by a number of incredible student leaders. Please note that this event requires a separate registration process as it will be taking place in a more interactive Zoom meeting format. So please be on the lookout for a link to register along with the recording of this meeting, or check out the events page on the Kroc Institute or Environmental Peacebuilding Association website. So see you all then next week at the same time, and thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.